Our next panel, comprising two people you've met before and one you haven't, are here. And we're going to be talking about authentication. Actually, no, you haven't met Robert. Sorry. I have, but you haven't. We have Sarah Whitfield, who you've already met. In the middle, we have Robert Upstone, for many years a curator not very far away from here at Tate Britain, and then at the Fine Arts Society, and more recently gone independent and beginning work on the catalogue raisonné of the paintings of Christopher Wood. And nearest to me, Karen Sanig, who is head of art law, and there's not many people who've got that job title, I don't think, at Mishcon de Reya. Now, we're talking about authentication, and I think that it's crucial, and I'm taking Karen's advice here, always take the advice of a lawyer before you open your mouth, is that we should make a clear distinction, or try to, between the work of a catalogue raisonné author or set of authors on one hand, and the work of an authentication panel or committee on the other. And I thought I might just ask Karen, if I may, to just begin by saying something on that difference in terms of your experience.
Before I talk, good afternoon, by the way, everybody. I'm slightly concerned because you're all looking at me thinking I'm going to have all the answers and all the protection for you, which I don't have, but I can help you. Good. And I do firmly believe in freedom of speech in this country, and I do firmly believe that all of you and all your expertise should be heard, and I really wouldn't worry too much about being sued, not because I can stand there and help you get out of it, but because we are still part of Europe and there are lots of protections for freedom of speech which came with the European Union. But that aside, which is rather controversial, I know, but that aside, I should say, I don't know if any of you read recently that the artist Agnes Martin has a case in New York, and it is the catalogue raisonné authors plus the authentication committee who are actually, it was the company behind the catalogue raisonné, I should say, not the authors themselves, who are being sued. Very interesting case. It's only just got off the ground, so we don't have the answers for today. But what have they done? They have refused to authenticate, I think is the right word to use, or attribute to Agnes Martin a certain number of works. And they're being sued by a gallery and a dealer who had sold these works for a lot of money and had to reimburse very upset clients. But really, it's not their job, is it? The authors of the catalogue raisonné would say it's not their job. All of you have said, and I've heard that loud and clear, it's not our job to authenticate. That's not what we should be asked to do. From time to time we do, because there are certain circumstances where we can, but it's not our job. Well, it might not be, but in my experience, and very often, the market demands it, the market expects it, and you are the market makers. I'm only looking at David because he's on the front row, but very often people will call up and say, I've got a Rothko deal, what's the due diligence? I've got David Anpam's certificate, so I'm all right, aren't I? And that's whether David wants that or he doesn't want that. That's what the market says. That puts you in a very precarious position because you're the market maker without knowing it. It also puts you in it puts the position of authenticating art in a precarious place too. So I'm just going to wind back, and I'll be very quick,
go
to
on,
my only legal case that went to court and put me off forever was about attribution. And it was in relation to an old master, something we've not discussed at all today, one of the hardest fields to give attributions to because the artists are long dead and nobody's around, as I was told by Sir Oliver Miller, nobody is actually alive who can say who put their hand to the work or not. And this was a case about a Van Dyck, an English period Van Dyck, which pre-internet, which a client of mine had bought, trusting with the dealer, who had told him it was a new discovery. And there were many dissenters out of the art historical experts who didn't believe that the artwork was by Van Dyck. There was one dissenter, Sir Oliver Miller, but there were 8 people who thought it was good. And that was the basis on which it was sold. Of course, when he bought it, his best friend in Texas, in his museum in the garden, walked in and said, what's that pile of God knows what on the wall? That's not by Van Dyck. Who told you it was? How much did you pay for it? £2 million, he said proudly. He went, let's do a bit of checking. No internet, remember. It was quite a lot of detailed checking, and it transpired that it had been sold at auction 2 years previously for £36,000 as after Van Dyke. And you'd say that wouldn't happen today because flick of a switch, you can look it up on ArtNet, art price, this, that and the other. Not that a lot of people do, but you can. And you should find the right information, but you don't always. Very long story short, we went to court and I needed an expert, and the London art market was furious because this was a fantastic purchaser of old masters and this had killed the golden goose. So they said to me, you need to go to Sir Oliver Miller, he will be your expert. Lo and behold, 2 weeks later, Sir Oliver comes to the office, teaches me everything you need to know about English period Van Dycks, which was very useful, taught the judge, was fantastic, was eloquent, was erudite, so good that the judge was completely convinced that this was not by Van Dyck, made a judgment on the fact this was not by Van Dyck, and said to my client, it was an honestly held opinion by the dealer that it was by Van Dyck, so I'm sorry you've lost your case, but it was very interesting to listen to Mr. Miller.
We learned a lot.
That was it. We learnt a lot. So just to explain to you, it's never open and shut. But we learnt a lot, and things have really got messier, not clearer, and I think the advent of the internet actually makes it worse. On that doom and gloom note.
Well, no, but that's a lovely moral case, a moral example, which would help explain very clearly and succinctly why catalogue resonance scholars do keep away, or do they? Several have said, Susan, I think, most explicitly recently said that the David Smith estate do not offer authentication. And I don't want to quote you, unless I've got that correct. But could I turn to our other two panellists, Sarah and Robert, and just ask, what's your experience of people confusing, if that's what they're doing, your jobs with the job of an authenticator?
Well, I sit on the authentication committee of the Magritte, the Magritte that's set up by the Magritte Foundation. So I was both a co-author of the catalogue raisonné, and I sit on this committee, which was set up in 2000. I would say that when a work is included in the catalogue raisonné, that is an authentication of sorts. And that's what most people take it to be. So when we were asked, we never said a work was authentic or fake. We said it would be included in the catalogue raisonné. That was our way around it. So what do we do on a committee? Well, first of all, our first rule is that we never go out to solicit owners of works. We only give an opinion if the work has been brought to us, if the owner solicits an opinion. Mm-hmm. And then we make quite clear that this is only an opinion. That is very, very important. We do not say, this is a work by Magritte, this is not a work by Magritte. We say, in our opinion, this is, because that is all it is. And I would say that I think as both the author of catalogue raisonnés and as a member who sits on various authentication committees, it's extremely important to be humble and not to be arrogant about one's so-called expertise. You can make mistakes. I have made mistakes. And I think it's incredibly important to, to always bear that in mind, that this is not an exact science. But the other thing I would say about committees is that it's safety in numbers.
Yeah.
It's very important to have somebody to discuss this with. And also very important to have somebody, again, I go back to what I've mentioned earlier, to have a conservator on board so that they can answer technical questions about this work.
But let me ask you a very crude question, because you did complete with David Sylvester the Magritte catalogue raisonné, and tell me if I'm wrong, but have since also published a kind of an addenda. Mm-hmm. Why do you need an authentication panel?
Because we actually...
Why can't they just wait till you get through to the next volume?
Unusually, we meet twice a year. It's amazing what is discovered. I mean, you can... you know, do all the research you possibly can, but works will still keep coming out. But what we mostly do now, we didn't in the catalogue raisonné do the drawings, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of drawings. And so mostly what we look at nowadays are drawings.
And would that be
works
with
on
a
paper.
view to, in due course, having a complete catalogue of the drawings?
No, I don't think there's any
That will never
question
be
of
realistic
that. No,
to
I don't.
achieve.
Well, I would like to do it, but I don't think the will to do it is out there by
And
other
on the authentication committee, would you say it's fair to say that at the core of any such committee, there is a connoisseur? At the end of the day, there is still, as it were, an author, an individual who, as David vividly described, has just in that old-fashioned way looked at things so often for so long that they can just
Well,
tell.
that will always be the person who's done the catalogue raisonné.
Well-
That will always be the person who's looked the
most.
most will be the person who has been compiling the catalogue raisonné. So,
Is it though?
Yeah, and will they be the
well,
market maker?
I think in
there
my
is a-
experience it is, but
I-
maybe you have a different
Robert,
experience.
Well, sorry, because I sort of
No.
sort of buzzing. And I would echo what Sarah has said. I think it's very important, actually. I think there are different cultural standpoints, and I think certainly in this country, it feels quite alien to start issuing framed certificates of authenticity and that kind of thing. And as a former National Museum curator, where I was brought many works for opinion, it was, my verdict on them was an opinion only, and people who didn't like my opinion, I said, well, look, I'd be delighted if it turned out, this was, right. One thing, and this touches on what Karen started with, that I think that if I am an owner, I expect you as the compiler of the catalogue raisonné and or your committee to have the relevant specialist knowledge and tools and intellect to actually form a measured judgment, whether you say this is or isn't the work of this artist, or whether you simply say I am or am not including it in my catalogue. And I would tend towards the former position in terms of, rather than issuing diktats. But I think it has been the case, it's in a very small number of cases where catalogue raisonnés have been started by enthusiasts who have no art historical training. They're incredibly well-meaning and hard-working, but they do not necessarily have the tools, either the background training or knowledge, to actually determine whether something is
No,
necessarily
I see what you mean. I was assuming that
authentic.
these were all art historians doing.
No, in
I'm coming from
France,
the
it's
catalogue
the-
raisonné point of view, but there are projects where that has
Yeah.
taken place.
Karen, go on, what you...
Well, no, in France, as you all know, a lot of the comités are made up by heirs, and they just happen to be the people who inherited, and they're different from the people. There's a division between the people who own the moral rights, who have the capacity to authenticate, and the people who own the intellectual property rights, who have the capacity to give the authority to reproduce. So you can imagine that at the base is very complicated.
Yikes. Could you just spend a minute spelling that out for us? Because especially the moral rights and how
because
it might work in France
Because
as opposed to
there
the
is
UK or
what-
US.
In France, there's what you call forced heirship. So a certain percentage of all estates, the artist's estate, has to go to a son or a daughter or the nearest nephew or relative. And not if the artist dies without leaving a will, it's a different person who inherits, or strand of people. Then in this country it goes to a much broader strand of people. So I was very involved in the Hermitage Foundation did a 2-day symposium on posthumous bronzes in law and art history, and we were looking at some Degas and Degas bronzes and looking at the numbering system for Degas which had been produced posthumously. And I was listening to Dita and his numbering system and thinking back to the Degas. I'm sure all of you know better than I do how confusing the Degas numbering system is. And then there had been a new potential find of Degas, and then we looked to France to say, well, who in France can actually have the right to authenticate? And it turned out there were split rights. One, the foundry, where the Degas was produced, had rights. One, the moral rights owners, who happened to be the children of a nun who had inherited from someone who had nothing to do with anything. And believe it or not, they were plonked at the back of the conference and they didn't know a thing about art history. And then there were actual people who had rights to produce copies. So it's extraordinarily complicated, but that's the nutshell. But once that hits the market in any other jurisdiction, the confusion that creates is absolutely enormous.
Gosh, okay.
It's okay, I sort it all out, you don't have to.
Fantastic. That's what we go to Ms. Gondorea, and they'll
But
sort
Nick,
all that for us.
can I
No,
also
come on.
say that we also make sure that we're very heavily insured against legal
I did want to just follow on from Karen's legal point by asking about the actual legal constitution
Yes.
of either a group of...
Well, I think before you go on to any of these committees, you want to make sure that you are insured
Yes.
against legal action.
As professional indemnity insurance.
Yes. And that's what we have.
I was writing this down. Yeah.
It's very, very important to feel safe
Uh-huh.
that you're going to be protected by.
And would they have what kind of legal entity is a authentication committee that you might sit on? Is it ultimately a charity? Is it a limited company?
How do they define themselves?
Yeah.
Well, in different ways.
Really?
Some are charities, yes, and some are foundations,
Uh-huh.
and some are just estates.
Yeah.
So it varies, but I think it's important to know that they are prepared to pay the insurance for you, just in case.
And I'm quite keen to open this out quite quickly to questions, but can I just ask one general question of all three of you, which is that my sort of instinct is that we hear so much in the popular media about fakes and fortunes and forgeries, and it's all terribly dramatic and skullduggery, that actually the reality on the ground, certainly in my experience when I'm asked to authenticate things, is that 99 times out of 100 it's actually quite easy to do, and that there are not so many...
Easy to do fakes.
Easy to... If you practice long enough, you get those little brushstrokes. No, the authentication is the work is the easy bit, frankly. Identifying...
Gosh, no.
That's not your experience.
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the committees
You actually
I
have
sit
seen
on.
lots, okay.
And that is the Arshil Gorky committee, where one of the biggest dilemmas we face is that Gorky had a pupil, and he taught his pupil to draw, so he would intervene on the pupil's drawings. Sometimes the pupil would intervene on Gorky's drawings, and sometimes they would make a drawing together. Now, how do you sort that out? That's not easy, I can tell you. That's a nightmare.
Okay, there should be a law against that.
The other thing also you should just mention very quickly is also the intervention of forensic testing and art history versus science. And the court recently was so confused by the two, it stuck with, and this is the recent decision of a judge, stuck with the art historical, you'll all be pleased to know, stuck with the art historical explanation because it felt that the art historian was closer, it was a Russian contemporary artist, felt that the art historian was closer to the artist than the forensic tester, even though the forensic testing threw up obvious scientific
So the judge
clues.
felt that the connoisseur, the person who actually seen the most of the work of that individual artist, remained
Should
the
be
strongest authority.
Judges are really helpful, aren't they, in their intervention?
We love them. I did say that was my last question before trying to open it up, but just on another, going back to catalogue raisonnés, let's just stick back to that, which is, of course, the subject of our day. We've talked quite a bit today about how they are, in many ways, an old-fashioned literary genre that has somehow stood the test of time. But that behind the individuals whose names appear on the covers of the books when they finally come out, or on the websites when they're published, there will be advisory committees, or there will be advisors of some kind. I'd just be interested to know the kinds of people who you've worked with. And if you were starting from scratch, if you were somebody, say, who's attending today who's starting from scratch, what kind of skills would you have on your advisory committee or your board of trustees? Perhaps that's the right model.
I didn't have any on mine.
Okay.
I mean, David Sylvester and I we worked with other people, but we had no board. We had no advisors. I think actually towards the end we asked Chris Green from the Courtauld if he would read what we had done and pick holes in it, but that was sort of post facto stuff. And so on and so forth. No, we didn't have an advisory.
But if you were to do it all over again, or perhaps when you do it all over again, your next catalogue resume, would you stick to that idea of it, that essentially it's a scholar or two scholars going through it alone, or would you try and put together a board of trustees or advisors?
I would want all the help I could get.
You would. And that would be a conservator, a legal
Definitely
expert.
a conservator, and in the ideal world, a conservator of oil paintings, a paper conservator as well.
Yeah.
So you'd have a broad sort of church of conservation, which I think nowadays you need, because it is, art history itself is becoming more forensic based anyway.
Yes.
I mean, it's going in that direction.
Yeah.
So I think that has changed so much that you would have to take that into account.
And Robert, just tell us quickly about the Christopher Wood project and how that's set up, in how you as the scholar and the researcher relate to the advisors you or colleagues you may have.
Yes, because I think perhaps you're better at it than I am, but contrary to your feeling that it was usually pretty cut or dried whether a work was definitely by
I just meant that,
artist X
that
or
you didn't
not.
spend your whole time discovering fakes, that most of the time you were probably worrying about, was it the 1920s version or the 1921 version?
Well, I know. And in many cases, the works that one sees are, actually it is pretty easy to say that's not right, or yes, it definitely is right because it's got those exhibition marks, and There are also a group with Wood, work somewhere in the middle, where he was an artist who varied his style, his whole approach to painting, almost canvas by canvas. One of the things that sort of made me decide to definitely do it was having 5 works from 1925 next to each other by chance, and each one of them having so highly individual and different an approach to the making of painting, the actual marks and the way that they were made, that it encouraged me to sort of want to try and delve further into that. But I think that having all of that responsibility of trying to decide, is something definitely by Wood, is something definitely not by Wood, is a lot on one person's shoulders. And I know all of us who have worked in museums or in auction houses or in the commercial world know that 2 pairs of eyes is better than 1. And if one can find a panel of, in my case, 4 scholars who know the period well and are also very well versed in the making of catalogue raisonnés, that support can be really essential. And also, I think if one has reservations about a picture and it goes out for consideration to your advisory panel, and each one of them comes back with the same viewpoint that you have, then if we do all end up in court with Karen as our defence counsel, we can say, look, actually, we've all come to the same conclusion. The balance of probability is that this is wrong, and it also does rather undermine angry owners.
You followed the proper process.
It's a fair, and I think also, I was talking about this earlier with Charles Beddington, who's here. I think we do something which hasn't come out today, and which Charles was bringing up very strongly, is the responsibility to owners, actually. It is a very, very important aspect of what compilers do, and we have to treat their property and the implications of what we say with respect.
Well, I'd like now to open it up. So why don't, Charles, I can see you there. Why don't you just, could you give us that point directly? Putting you on the spot.
I was wondering in the earlier conversation, the earlier panel, about whether one should try and make one's entries as objective as possible, because although if there are condition issues, and obviously the further back one goes through the centuries, the more important the condition issues are. If you actually state in a catalogue that, if you actually start giving very subjective opinions about the quality of an object or whether this is not a good work by the artist, it obviously can have an extremely damaging effect on the fortunes of its present owner, which one should consider. And I think a lot of people who write catalogue raising don't think about that. I mean, it's very easy to say things that sort of cross one's mind in the catalogue raising, which actually have a sort of effect on the object.
Well, I think Lee put it very eloquently earlier when he talked about the diplomacy that a catalogue resident authors need to have vis-a-vis the art market, and that it had to be quid pro quo. And that kind of diplomacy, I'm sure you'd all agree, is absolutely equally necessary in the case of owners, without whom you're not going to get your project off the ground. And
I think it's important when you start out on a catalogue raisonné to leave the whole question of money out of it altogether. That you just take it for granted that none of this stuff is worth a penny. And to be completely detached from the market on that. So I do rather disagree with that. I think you have to behave as though these things are worthless. And then that makes you completely detached and you can just be totally honest about it.
Susan.
I just wanted to make a distinction that perhaps I confused people with in terms of the issue of condition. Because I don't think it's an aesthetic question. It obviously, if you see a painting that's been badly damaged, it does affect your impression of its quality as an aesthetic object. But I think it's really critical to try to disentangle those two. And I agree that catalogue raisonnés should not venture into the aesthetic evaluation. Every artist I've ever studied did fabulous works and did a lot that if they came in if they didn't come directly from the studio, you would not call them by that artist. You think they're not good, they're minor, they're whatever. So I think the aesthetics are not the issue, but I think if you have documentation, let's say, an alteration made by the artist, certainly, or documentation you're willing to stand behind and cite as evidence, then I think there is some duty to recognize that this painting or this sculpture, which was formerly painted black, has now been painted green, leaving aside the question of whether that was an improvement or not, and just state it that way.
Okay, more questions? Joe, I think, over here. Well, we've got time for both, but yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks. On this question of responsibility or condition, I wondered about where the responsibility lies when a work is in the public domain, has been placed somewhere, a sculpture, and the pattern that changes over many years, and then who is responsible for its upkeep? The owner, the conditions have changed. This work is maybe one of an addition. It looks very good in some places, it doesn't look very good in other places. It opens a whole can of worms in relation to the value question, and also it comes back again to when the work is acquired, should there be something set up about how it's maintained and who maintains it?
Do you know the City Sculpture Project? Yes. Well, they had a work by a client of mine, so I better not say what work it was. And that exactly I was thinking you were talking about that particular work when you were describing it. There are many examples, but this particular work, usefully at the time, our clients who are American agreed to loan it to the City Sculpture Project. They did think about, which is very unusual, they did think about committing to writing about who should pay for the upkeep and what should happen if it got damaged. But not in enough detail, and it did get severely damaged, and the City Sculpture Project had a lot of difficulties because they didn't cordon it off enough, and then people used it interactively and children were jumping off it. Yes, interactively, it's apparently the right expression, and children were jumping off it, and these clients told me they were extremely disappointed, but they decided that they wouldn't sue because it was supposed to be for the public good. But you're absolutely right, if that's sorted out at the beginning, then it's not a problem, but actually most examples at the moment have not been thought through, so public sculpture at the moment could potentially be a nest of vipers.
More questions on the theme of authentication specifically.
I wanted to say something about the growing amount of peripheral material which comes with a picture or an artwork. The provenance, in other words, where sometimes there's a growing number of things that are coming out. I'm asked occasionally to authenticate paintings for the artist living in Barnes Graham. And you get a number of people presenting the picture or image with the picture, which has a letter saying, "Oh, my grandfather owned this back when." And it's even where sometimes you might have reservations about the picture, there's this so-called written documentation which is going with it, which seems to suggest that it's been in the family for a very long time and was bought originally for the artist back in 1952 or something like that. And I was wondering whether, how many other people have found that provenances, which usually are part of the authentication process, whether other people have run into problems where you can't disprove the documentation, but it's running at odds with what you think the picture is or isn't.
Yeah, that's the...
There are so many grandmothers out there, so many attics and so many grandmothers. Yes, I think you have to see the documentation, first of all. There's a lot of hearsay. That, strangely enough, it's not very often that you actually present it with a letter, because people on the whole don't keep documentation. I'm talking about private collectors mostly. So unless you can see the actual document, then I think you just have to ignore it, unless there's corroborating evidence. But yes, it happens a lot.
I think you have to be very, very careful of any kind of note that may have been written at God knows how many years distance. And in fact, when you were speaking, Geoffrey, I was reminded, this is a highly indiscreet story, but when I worked for the Tate, my team was offered, I think it may have been a gift actually rather than a purchase, but we were offered a work by a family who had been friends with a number of artists. And I forgive me, I can't actually remember the way round. I think they said it was an Alan Jones. Anyway, we finally got the photographs. It wasn't an Alan Jones, and we said, this isn't by Alan Jones, and the family got very upset and said, yes, it is. Our parents knew Alan Jones in the 60s or whatever. And when we sort of fed back to them, we said, could this not possibly be the work of Keith Vaughan? And there was a little hiatus, and then they came back and said, oh yes, that's right, it's the work of Keith Vaughan. The letter that they had initially sent was all about how Alan Jones or Keith Vaughan, I can't remember which now, came to stay for the weekend, this was a painting that was presented, and they just transposed the identity, and I think they knew both people or whatever. But that can happen, and I think as historians, we have to always approach documents of whatever sort with a healthy scepticism, or at least a questioning approach to them.
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman there. Is that Julian?
Can I just add,
This is...
we have the very interesting position that we see a search today on a picture, and we compare the information given on the picture today with the information given 5 or 10 years ago on the same picture in terms of provenance. And increasingly, because people see the importance of provenance, they exaggerate, substitute, do all sorts of things to try and enhance the provenance. Because originally provenance was of great value in proving authenticity if you had a really complete and provable trail of the history of the picture from the artist. But increasingly that's not the case with many private deals and so on in the art market. And our own certificates are being faked in order to try and give credibility to the provenance of people submitting items to authenticity committees. So I say to all the committees, for goodness sake, check with us if you see anything from us which is not necessarily directly relevant to your job, but at least we are interested in knowing whether it's been failed. So this is quite a jungle. We're just starting discussions with the major auction houses at the moment about changing the basis of the contracts of consignment, so that unless the consignor is emphatic and the buyer emphatic that they want confidentiality for 20 years, it will be limited to, say, 10 years. Because one of the reasons people make up all this provenance is because of the way in which the provenance is being suppressed in the public auction process.
Thank you. Interesting. David, right here at the front, and then lady here.
Hello. I mean, I think there's 1,001 things you could say about this particular panel session, and I think it's a beating heart for the whole day. But one of the things I wanted to say was that some would point out that in recent years there's a growing number of collectors who, when they purchase a work, do not seem overly concerned that it's not in the catalogue raisonné. And I believe once upon a time, whether it was or wasn't in the catalogue raisonné would be seen as the dividing line between life and death as well. And this worries me because it suggests that somehow you either have an overheated market in which people want to grab a Pollock, a Rothko, whatever.
Get less fussy as the market tightens. Yeah.
It's either that or else in some way the authority of the catalogue raisonné is fading.
I'd really like to... Sorry, go ahead,
But
Sarah.
I was just saying, a lot of people buy on the internet now, don't they? They buy works unseen on the internet, and then they come to us asking for an authentication.
Yes, that's
So,
true.
I mean, it is. Well, I've seen a huge rise in that, in purchasing a painting that they can't ever have seen, that they never come into contact with, but will pay large sums of money and then think, oh, well, yes, maybe we should go and get this authenticated. I don't agree that the catalogue raisonné is fading, and I wonder what you base that on.
Can I just say something? I think it's something to do with the whole post-truth generation.
Yes.
You have to bring in Donald Trump eventually.
No.
Truth.
I just think that that sense of authority is being challenged by the current generation and by...
Oh, that's interesting, yes.
I would love to bring in Karen here. Yeah.
Yeah, because of course it happens, people buy and then regret or check. I don't know which way to put it. But also you have to see the role of the middleman or men. What did you call it? Post-truth generation. I don't think it's a post-truth generation. The art market, from my helicopter view, is littered with eccentricities. And when I participate in a day like today, it's fantastic because we hear words about truth and honesty and detachment. And then there are other parts of the market and they operate on a different level of truth. And it's their level of truth. And so they may not talk. And particularly, I go back to the case I mentioned, which was a very old case. But the dealer was very keen to make the sale. And he didn't really explain to the unsuspecting buyer, although the buyer was a large collector and maybe ought to have known better, but didn't, wanted to splash his cash. But he didn't understand the importance of Sir Oliver Miller's unfinished catalogue raisonné. He just didn't get it. And you'll be surprised, people will spend multi-millions and they will not do their due diligence. If they want something, they like it, they've fallen in love with it, somebody persuades them it's good, they'll buy it. Less now, because people talk about art as investment, but they exist and there are a lot of them.
Yes, and the standard retort is caveat emptor. But it's
Less and less so.
in a few places, there's another principle, caveat venditor. And, you know, it's a fine balance there.
Absolutely.
And another general point
Go ahead.
is that just say a work pops up and it wasn't in the catalogue raisonné, or there is no catalogue raisonné and none is planned. If it's deadly genuine, and there's not the slightest doubt, if you say you're not going to give an opinion or authenticate it, the owners think
It's a fake.
Well, in fact, David Sylvester was sued by an art dealer, actually, in Belgium, because when he was presented with a work that was pretty clearly a fake, but certainly was enough like a Magritte to have convinced this dealer, who was a dealer in Magritte. And when David said, "I don't know," 5 years later, he was sued for not giving an opinion. I mean,
Unsuccessfully.
unsuccessfully.
Good.
But
Could I just?
that's also a danger.
Put Karen on the spot, if I may, and just ask you a very direct question. Do you think that the catalogue raisonné, as a species of document, has any greater or lesser kudos in the legal world than it used to?
Don't think people in the legal world ever understood the kudos of the catalogue raisonné. So it's
They
not,
don't read them that much.
It's not greater or lesser
but
than it was.
Sense of deference to it or its use in a case.
It's one tool in a series of tools in a case. It's not the only one, but it never would be the only one. It would be wrong to think you only relied. So Sir Oliver Miller's catalogue raisonné wasn't complete.
No.
So we needed the expert himself and his
so
own
the
knowledge.
charismatic expert witness is what swings the boat there. But this lady here was next.
This is the first time that this event, this focus, has taken place, which is remarkable given the state of the market, huge stakes involved financially, legally, etc. What does the panel think about teaching of art history now in terms of looking at the problematic in the catalogue raisonné? Because it seems to me that we need more and more individuals with the rigour of approach which catalogue raisonné wants, to both interact with the art world, with collectors, with museums. But traditionally in this country, certainly, the catalogue raisonné has been the province of either the connoisseur or the museum curator. Latterly, with modern British art in particular, art historians have become involved in producing the best catalogues. But this has not been part of the pedagogy of art history. And we're losing a trick, I think, still in the university.
Robert, I'd like you to respond, but then I think what we're going to have to do is just hear the questions that are outstanding and hold them, because otherwise we are going to totally lose our plot time-wise. Is that okay? There will be refreshments over which those questions can be picked up more thoroughly. Is that democratic-ish? So we've heard that question. That's a great one, and I'm thinking straight back to Rosalind Krauss doing her PhD on David Smith. I mean, that was quite wonderful to be reminded of that. But Robert, you were going to respond to that.
I think you've raised actually a crucial question, because in fact, if you look at the teaching of art history and the ebb and flow of different tendencies within it in the last 30, 40 or 50 years, it has changed greatly. And unfortunately, this is nothing against the teaching of art history as it currently is, but the reality is that it is generally more theoretical or discursive in its nature. It is not focused or literary. It's
But I think the wheel is turning again. And
it is, but it is
slowly
not object-based.
It's becoming more object-based again.
That's a biggie. Could we just hear the questions that were outstanding?
I know what you mean.
Lady right there.
agree.
But it has to be.
Yes, no, absolutely.
I've sold over in my career over 100,000 catalogue raisonnées. On occasion,
Stop boasting.
Author of the print runs an entire edition of catalogue raisonnées. It's my observation that today the stature of the catalogue raisonné is higher than it was 30 years ago. But that's because we deal directly with the buyer's line. They walk into my shop, they ask for advice, and they buy them. It seems to be now the catalogue resume point is the strongest point and the point that the people who buy and pay me money for catalogue resumes are most interested in.
Thank you. That's a
Ask
very
if they
positive.
would they be more dealers or individuals?
They could be anything. They could be art dealers, they could be lawyers, lots of them from your company. Everybody. I mean, we sell across the whole market to collectors, dealers, auction houses.
This one and then back.
Yeah, in terms of authentication and consideration of painting, it seems to me that you can divide two very clear things. One is your consideration of the painterly nature of the work, and the other is its problems. And whereas you can perhaps not know about its painterly state, presentation or image, you can sure as hell know all of the facts that you can research or people can present evidence on with respect to the bonds. And so there's no way that you need to say you don't know whether a thing was in an exhibition or was sold to a particular. You do know, and you can be very explicit and clear about that. So it seems to me that there are two levels on which you can.
Okay, I am going to...
That involves working very closely with the art.
Lady on the aisle at the back. Oh, and, okay, go ahead, please.
Just in terms of legal liability, sort of where the line is between somebody publishing and saying something and then the process of being able to sue them or hold them responsible. We just republished, well, at the end of last year, we republished the Christopher White's catalogue, wasn't it? And there's been a number of reattributions in that catalogue as a result of the occurrence of Eric Queen's pictures and the work that's been done on that. And I just wondered, that work was obviously published, it was a massive, important book in its time, and it still is. But what would be the accountability, the legal accountability of, say, Christopher White or the occurrence of Eric Queen's pictures if his attributions changed again?
Can we do that in the coffee break?
Yeah, that's a technical one. That's a good, interesting question. Especially when you go back to republishing a catalogue recently or revising a catalogue recently rather than redoing it from scratch.
Is it just in hard copy as well?
It was.
Yeah.
But
that's another question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask the panel a different question about authentication, which is not just the instance when someone comes to you and asks you to authenticate a work, but when you see a work going for sale and you know it's not right, about your responsibility as the given experts to, make it clear that you don't think it's right.
Good question. The timing of one's intervention. Great. And I'm sure there's a long outstanding question just there. Is there not? Lady right by you, Emma? No? No more bids. Charles, one last word from Charles, then we're going to invite David up. Yeah.
I just want to make the point that in the old master fields, I mean, there is a major issue about catalogue reasoning not necessarily being written by the people who should be writing. I mean, there are opportunists who pick commercially attractive artists and decide that they'll write a catalogue raising them in order to charge, X or X%
to become a market interloper.
In order to include it. Without actually any sort of connoisseurly attributes whatsoever.
Great.
I'm sure Thomas would agree.
We must swap anecdotes and stories. Now, thank you very much to my panel on authentication. That was really interesting. And we are now